Today I'm going to discuss a very interesting subject with all of you of men with bags. And no, I am not talking about the men walking around your local shopping mall carrying a man purse. That's a completely different subject. But you've probably all by now seen different images of your friends sharing pictures from the ancient world of these progenitors that are carrying a bag or holding a bag, and in the other hand, they have what appears to be a seed or a pine cone. And I've heard all sorts of very interesting descriptions and theories about this from various researchers and writers, because we find these images all over the world. When we look over at Göbekli Tepe, or we look over to the ancient Hittite peoples, the Assyrians, Akkadians, Phoenician Canaanites, the Egyptians, Mesoamerica, it doesn't matter where you seem to look, all over the world, we find these images connected to these ancient cultures. And when we see them, I've heard people describing them very interestingly. Some have said, well, maybe these are ancient shamans, and these shamans were carrying around various entheogenic substances or psychedelics that they were giving to humanity to awaken them and bring them awareness of new religions. Others have said, well, maybe these are seeds of consciousness. Others have said maybe these are seeds for agricultural crops, and they were carrying different things in them. And I find that very interesting because the way that we decode these images tells me a lot that in our collective consciousness, we have a memory or a way of interpreting this. And I go back to a quantum mechanics principle when I think of this, which is that the relation of objects are as real as the objects themselves. So we give purpose and reason and meaning to these things. And I don't think anybody is particularly wrong, because, they could have had multiple things in these bags. And, when we look at the mysteries, it's like a lock that you have to turn 7 times with the key to unlock it. So there's always so much more there that comes out with this symbolism. But I want to share with you all what I've learned from talking to various archaeologists, anthropologists, and visiting the British Museum and the Louvre, alongside my own theories about what I believe these ancient bags were for and what's in their hands. So what we have to do is we have to look back at these depictions. And first of all, when we go back into the ancient Assyrians, which I've spent a lot of time looking at over at the British Museum, we find all sorts of very interesting depictions of these men with bags. We also find in these other depictions that they are sometimes depicted on what looks like to be a wristwatch on their hand, especially when we look over at the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II from 883 to 859 BCE. We link him over to Nimrod. Some have said, okay, maybe he was Anunnaki, Anki, or Enlil. But I think it's important to notice that in these images, they're usually pointing over at a sun disk connected to the solar mysteries, and this various jewelry or emblems they'd have on that we might say is a watch, again, is connected to those mysteries. And who knows, maybe the watch might have actually acted as a sun disk or a solar wheel that would help them to tell time. It's hard to say, but I think it's most certainly very interesting that the symbolism on the watch matches up to the other solar iconography or symbolism, which would make a lot of sense, especially when you look over at the various mysteries that we have from the ancient stellar groups, solar and lunar. When you see over at Osiris or Horus or Ra, we again find that disk and sun iconography. But what we see when we find these beings over in the Assyrians is that it's said by anthropologists that, okay, what they were holding in their hand was a date palm, and they are spreading pollen that's from their bags. And pollen would have been very important to these people. And what I've also come across in this work of why the date palm is important, that we can look over into various mysteries around the world. Most certainly, I am reminded of the works of Helena Blavatsky, who has talked about the sacred tree rites going back into the Brahmic traditions of ancient India, where we find tree worship, the tree of life, or the world tree, but most certainly especially the date palm. The date palm is very specific all throughout the Middle East. It has all kinds of health benefits to it. It's loaded with vitamins, minerals, various nutrients. It can be used for all sorts of medicinal purposes. It's got all sorts of practical uses. The date palm is probably one of the most beneficial things in the world that you could have. And so that's very interesting. And what we might ask ourselves is that why are there these ancient progenitors or these missionaries coming all over the world with these bags seeding civilization? And I think that's very easy to answer. A very simple question, if you ask me, and we're going to come back to why they would be carrying pollen and why that would be so important. But when we look at the idea that there have been ancient cataclysms on this earth, especially going back to around 12,000 years ago, there is a lot of evidence coming back from geologists and otherwise that are suggesting that there were a number of things that happened on the earth, that there were earthquakes, there were floods. We find that there was great destruction. For some, they'll say, okay, maybe this was solar storms and CMEs and eruptions, which I think it was that as well. But there was also great destruction through what it would appear to be a comet, something hitting the earth. And to find out more about that, we can even go back into the Plato story about Atlantis, where Plato was initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. He learned about it from his uncle Critias, who learned about it from his great-great-great-grandfather Solon, who had traveled to Egypt and met with a priest named Sanchis of Sais. Sanchis of Sais said, "Silly Greeks, you think you're so informed about your flood stories, but you Greeks are like children to us." There have been many ancient civilizations that have been destroyed by fire, by water, by ancient cataclysms. And with that, we learn that these civilizations kind of spread out and moved from whatever. There was a great maritime civilization on Earth that was all over the Earth, had spread over from Egypt, from Baalbek over in Lebanon up into India, was all over the world, and in Asia was all over the world with Atlantis, and at one point probably with the various poles that we find with the North and South Pole. Those were very, very different places at some point. And there have been authors that have explored this even more recently, such as in the work of Graham Hancock. We've seen him talk about this in his Magicians of the Gods work. And he's done a fantastic job of looking at what geologists have said and looking at various records going back to Göbekli Tepe. And again, we find these depictions of these men with bags there. And I think that what this shows us is that at one point there was a great destruction upon the earth. This would have affected all kinds of agriculture. It would have affected civilizations. People would have had to go into caves and underground hiding and to more subterranean areas. We would have digressed. We would have gone backwards in our evolution, and people would have had to come back up to the surface and learn everything all over again from scratch and almost become like primitive cave people again. And this is very interesting because when we look at what ancient historians have said, especially when you go back into what Plutarch said, he said that all the ancient gods of Egypt were really the antediluvian kings who were deified after death. That means that the pre-flood kings on the earth were deified after death. And I've looked at a lot of these antediluvian mysteries. I have in giant case files over here that I've collected and all sorts of books on the subject. But you really got to go look back into the stories of Egypt. Of course, we see at the beginning of Egyptian mythology, we learn about gods like Ptah and the demiurges and whatnot. But the main progenitors that we're going to learn about there, of course, when you look back at these mysteries, we'll learn about Osiris. Osiris, you might notice some key characteristics about him. He was a giant and he had an elongated skull. And we're going to go back to why this elongated skull is very important in a moment, and why we find that in all of our mysteries, and why everyone around the world later on wanted to bind their heads up to imitate these god kings that were on earth. But again, Osiris being a giant with an elongated skull, he is one of many that we find in various mysteries about civilization being seeded. When we look back into Mesopotamia, Babylonia, or the ancient Chaldean mysteries, we find they had a visitor named Dagon or Oannes. And this visitor that came to their shores, he's often depicted with these scales like a fish, wearing a fish hat or a mitre that's covering up somewhat of an elongated head. And he would have been called Sidon because he was given this attribute for teaching them about agriculture. Well, he approached a very primitive people at those times. And we're told that he was a very good man, but these people did not know how to even make fires or agriculture. He taught them about having a civilization and brought them back up after the cataclysm. And of course, traditionally, we're told of these periods linked to the cataclysms that we would have had in the Pleistocene period when we go before the Ice Age, and then we would have had the Holocene after that up until now. And there's these various different periods of civilization where people would have come up from this state and civilization would have had to been reestablished. But as you can imagine, on the earth, the places that we would have food and crops and agriculture would have been very limited. So I believe that what we started to see is that we started to see these ancient missionaries, so these progenitors, come back and help them. And what would they have done is they would have brought with them sort of agricultural secrets. They would have had to seed things again with a type of pollen. So the pollen from a bag makes sense. And this also makes sense to why the bee would have been sacred to a lot of these ancient civilizations. Like we find with the ancient Egyptians, that the bee was sacred to them. The bee was sacred to the great Christian king, Charlemagne. We also find that in the symbol for the fleur-de-lis, which you find over in France or Quebec, that looks like a flower, but you can actually look at it and decode it as a bee. The bee is sacred in Freemasonry. The bee would be the great pollinator of the rose, and the rose, of course, connected to the Tudor dynasty and into the mysteries, is very sacred as well. So these ancient pollinators would have been very, very sacred, very, very important as they went around the world reestablishing civilization. Another fact to consider here symbolically is that these great kings or progenitors or Atlantean missionaries, whatever you want to call them, who are often portrayed with their bags of pollen, spreading it around using a date, is that they had a very direct mission. They had a purpose. The earth had obviously been devastated, and bees were hard to come by, which were needed to sustain life, which obviously the bee would have had a lot of difficulty surviving through these various cataclysms and difficult circumstances on Earth, so they needed to bring back that life force they had to become the great beekeepers. There's a great Assyrian relief of one of these kings. He's protected by two winged guides or gods on each side of him that are instructing him and showing him the way. And I think that's very interesting, that why a lot of these kings have been called the great beekeepers, even in Egypt. We also know that with the date palm, its trunks have been used as a beehive. We've seen so many different cycles after cycles after cycles on this planet. In fact, these beings would have also carried on the ancient Serpentine mysteries that we get over from India, we get over from Egypt, and all over the world. And I've also discussed this at length with Brien Foerster. When I've been in Egypt with Brien Foerster, we've looked at these various sites where these cataclysms would have affected the earth, and he's written about this, he's presented about this for years. He's actually measured where we can look at our various temples where they would have shifted 23 degrees after the cataclysms hit, after various solar storms started hitting, after sort of comets have hit the earth, earthquakes, floods, everything else that you can imagine hit the earth, and chaos erupted over these very disruptive and dangerous periods. And what we start to see within these particular Serpentine mysteries and migrations is that the earth used to be a very different place. In the Bible, there's a very curious verse about how in the days of Peleg, it says that the continents were still together, that they were still connected before shifting and breaking apart. We also find mentionings to these Serpentine migrations of these energy paths or ley lines where all these ancient temples were built. We find this actually mentioned in the Bible as well, especially when we go back into Genesis and forward. And when you go look in places like Peru, where Brien lives, we find that there is this mythology connected to Amaru, which is a serpent god, and Manly P. Hall has always said that Amaru is where we get the name America from, Amaruca, land of the plumed serpent. And you don't have to look much further to see other connections with that. You can go into the Yucatan and find pyramid culture there, as we find it on both sides of the Atlantic. But in their culture over in the Yucatan there, we find Quetzalcoatl or Cuculcan, and the Serpentine mysteries there as well, all connected into their peoples. But up in Peru, we find all sorts of fascinating mysteries there. We find Viracocha. And Viracocha is where we look at the paths, so the migration paths of the energy ley lines. And when I've discussed this with Brien, what he feels is that these certain solar destructions and everything else that was hitting the earth would have moved down these energy ley line paths and through this migration and destroyed all the temples and places and just decimated them and brought total destruction.
Okay, this gate or opening is 23 degrees off north, south, east, west, which doesn't make sense because almost all temples around the world are aligned to the cardinal directions. So what that could be telling us is that this was constructed when the planet was vertical, which would have been possibly 12,000 years ago. The joinery in the granite stone is perfect. It's level within 1 degree. The dynastic Egyptians could not do work in hard stone at this kind of accuracy. And so imagine, if you will, according to the theory of Robert Schoch, the geologist, the plasma from the sun 12,000 years ago hit certain parts, not the whole planet, but it hit certain parts, and it was attracted by magnetic lines and fields. You see here there's a lot of damage on the inside, so it could have been that the energy traveled straight through here, and then there was a granite structure here that exploded because of the heat, and then those two stargates, one on the left, one on the right, were both knocked over.
We find other clues, of course, over in Robert Schoch's work, which you can probably see up behind me here. With Forgotten Civilization, we find water erosion clues and everything else, especially when we look over at the Sphinx, and we see other great disasters that were probably on the Earth during those times that also give us clues to much older dates of civilization than we even thought before. But anyhow, with these particular clues that we find over in Brien's work, it gets even more exciting because that brings us forward to the Paracas people that he's been examining now. The Paracas people he's found elongated skulls for. And these elongated skulls in Brien's work are found in areas in Paracas where there have been date palms. And remember what we said is that these men with bags would have had pollen in them, and they would have been using the date palm and spreading the date palm. And of course, the date palm is one of the most beneficial things in the world. Has tons of medicinal benefits, has tons of practical uses. It is absolutely amazing. So they had it in that area, but today's modern people there do not have the date palm in any of their uses. They ignore it. It's practically useless to them, unlike in the Middle East, where it has a very long history and its uses are known and it goes back a long ways. Well, Brien, alongside L.A. Marzulli and other researchers, have done some fantastic work exploring the origins of what these elongated skulls mean, or who are they from, or who were they. He's done DNA tests, and these DNA tests have been very expensive and they've been very controversial. It's been a difficult road for him, and I've actually discussed this with him, and he's going to be coming on. We're going to be doing a video about this very soon. But what I actually think is very interesting in the work that Brien has done here is that he has discovered that these skulls belong to a different group of human being, like a subspecies category. Instead of being Homo sapien, they're actually Homo sapien Paracas, and they belong to a haplogroup known as H2A, and this would link them over to the Caspian Sea, the Northern Black Sea, especially when we look over in the Himalayan area. And this is absolutely different than anything we would see genetics-wise that would have come in from the Spanish conquest in 1532 CE, or anything that would have been in any kind of indigenous groups that would have been in that particular area. I really think that it's fascinating when we start to see the mysteries of these progenitors on this planet, or these missionaries that had elongated skulls, that were seeding civilization, that were coming to ancient peoples and teaching them secrets about how to reestablish their civilization or use the parts that were already there. And I find that absolutely fascinating. Last but not least, we can also find clues to who these ancient progenitors were. Even when we go and look in places like Ireland, I've talked to my friend David Halpin about this, and he's pointed out that the ancient rulers in Ireland, who were known as the Fir Bolg, literally translates to men with bags. And we also learn, of course, of the Tuat the Danann, which arrived to Ireland on flying ships, and they were ruled by an invisible king of the air, or ruling power of the air, connected to the Serpentine mysteries. And I do want to come back in another video talking about these sacred tree rites and why the trees were important to the ancient peoples. I plan on revisiting this by examining Helena Blavatsky's work in a future lecture about the secret doctrine and anthropogenesis, the tree of life, and why the tree is mentioned in the book of Genesis in the Bible, why it is sacred to the Kabbalah, why it is mentioned in the Vedic teachings, why Krishna is dancing around certain trees. I mean, these have been very sacred and holy teachings that have been around from the beginning of time. But most certainly, the date palm is mentioned and depicted all over the place in these writings and teachings. So I want to know what all of you think. Of course, I want you to tell me about it in the comments below. What do you think was in these bags? Was it in fact connected to the date palm? Was it pollen or was it something else? Tell us why you think that, where you come up with these conclusions, and if you have some other argument to convince us otherwise. And until next time, remember to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends, and I'll meet you all at that place behind closed eyelids.